The content of this show does not represent the viewpoints or opinions of any organizations affiliated with the hosts or any guests on the show.
The information discussed in this show is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be used as medical advice. Please seek your medical provider for professional advice and medical care. Welcome to the Healthiest Argument podcast, where knowledge meets debate. Hi, I'm Caroline, a first-gen Taiwanese American experienced emergency nurse, now focusing on teaching evidence-based practice and helping nurses professionally develop.
Hi, and I'm Christina, a Cuban American, master's prepared family nurse practitioner with a broad variety of experience ranging from bedside to management and much more.
Each episode will each represent a topic, research the latest peer-reviewed journals, and battle it out to see who wins the healthiest argument.
With that said, let's dive into today's episode and see who will win the healthiest argument. Hello, everybody.
Hello, and welcome to
The Healthiest Argument podcast.
I'm Caroline.
And this is Christina.
Hello, everybody. So how you been? I feel like I haven't seen you in a couple months.
Yeah. Happy 2025.
2025.
Yeah. It's been busy. It's been great.
With the holidays.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you eat anything delicious?
Did I eat anything delicious? I guess the question is, what wasn't there?
I love that.
Yeah. Plenty of food, plenty of family, a lot of memories. So
Yes.
Can't complain. And you?
We ended up buying a prime rib roast, Wagyu,
Delish.
11-pounder.
Only?
Let's just say we had leftovers for days.
Fantastic.
It was delicious.
Yeah. Holiday leftovers are always the best.
Of course. So I will say, though, I do have some resolutions for the new year. Or, I mean, do we still call them resolutions?
I just call them
Goals.
Yeah. What's next?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very high on the list is diet.
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 I think that's like always pop famous. The diet.
Yes.
Weight loss.
All the above.
Health.
Activity.
How we look.
Yes.
A little vanity goes into that.
We're millennials. What do you expect?
Nothing less.
So, what were we talking about?
Well, before we dive into today's subject,
Yes.
I'd like to do a little recap of our pilot episode.
Yes, our pilot, coffee versus tea.
It was lovely. We had some great feedback. I'd like to mention we did a lot of research. We learned a lot during that first episode.
We did.
Yeah. We didn't really do a lot of video posting for that, just some reels.
Yes, technical difficulties.
As well. These are our learning moments.
Yes.
It was all welcomed.
Of course.
So I was coffee.
And I was defending tea.
Yeah. And there was a lot of fun facts, and we were able to discover some interesting data on the coffee and the tea. But I was actually wondering what our audience had to say about our polls regarding who is the healthiest, coffee versus tea.
Yes. So thank you all for voting on social media. On Instagram, we had 93% vote team coffee.
Coffee for the win.
And 7% for tea. But on Spotify, we had 75% vote team tea and 25% vote team coffee.
Well, look at that. That's pretty different.
Yes. But we appreciate all the votes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, to tag on to that, I had a lot of people reach out to me personally, and they were like, hey, I'm actually voting for tea.
Wow.
Yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
Coffee. Anyways, it was great to hear everybody's feedback.
Yes.
the
And what
different
team they were
perspectives.
on.
Yeah.
Yes. Love it.
Absolutely. So talking about coffee versus tea, in today's episode, I'll be debating sugar.
And I will be defending sugar alternatives or sugar substitutes.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes.
So tell me, what do you carry in your pantry?
Oh, in my pantry. Well, I, of course, have sugar. I have raw sugar, powdered sugar. You got to do that for the baking, right?
Always the powdered sugar.
But I do have some sugar alternatives. I do have honey. We love honey either when we're sick or on desserts. I like it with my Greek yogurt. So we have a couple different honeys. We have Manuka, we have an allergy blend, and I do have date syrup and dates. I really, really like using that as an alternative. It's a little bit less sweet than honey. And for me, it's like pretty balanced, especially with coffee. I do like that. I also have coconut sugar in my pantry for some baking alternatives if we're feeling a little less sweet.
I've never had the coconut sugar.
Really?
Do you like it?
Yeah, it kind of tastes like molassesy, so like brown sugar, which I also have in my pantry.
Of course.
Yeah, I cannot have it, right? I have molasses and I have allulose. So those are my alternatives in my pantry right now.
Excellent.
Yes.
Well, I have mostly just white sugar.
Yes.
I think some raw sugar. Is it even raw? A little brown sugar and of course confectioner's sugar.
Yes.
I had monk.
Okay.
And then I had some stevia drops. Those have been tossed.
What are your thoughts on monk and stevia?
Everything for me is about the flavor profile.
Yes.
So I always have to debate, do I want to have that little residue flavor that like sneaks up on you at the end there?
Yeah.
Or would I just rather not use any sugar?
Okay.
Yeah. So it's really sugar or no sugar for me.
I feel the same way. That's why I don't carry stevia either. It's kind of just that aftertaste. I don't really like it.
Yeah.
Along with a lot of other artificial sugars or sugar alcohols, unless they're like in gum, where you can like, it's like temporary.
Yeah, very short-lived.
Yes,
on the palate.
Definitely. So Christina, talk to me. What is the history of sugar?
So it's funny you mentioned that. I know you talked about having honey in your pantry earlier.
Yeah.
So when sugar started coming around, it was actually a preferred choice of sweetener because honey was not so easy to cultivate or capture because of the bees. And so there's like a danger, right? When you're trying to get some honey. So sugar became famous because of its easier way of, well, I guess not getting stung to death. So I'm actually going to look at a little bit of a timeline here. And sugarcane was actually first found. And people in New Guinea, it's like a grass that grows, basically. They would take this grass, the sugarcane, and then they would chew on it and extract the sweetness from the sugarcane. And so little by little, as we humans do, we find other ways to extract and make things, right? So we found a way to go ahead and turn it or chemically refine it into pretty much the sugar that we know in today's day. So maybe not exactly the same, but this was actually back in 8000 BCE.
Wow.
Eventually, it made its way across Southeast Asia, and it eventually landed in Europe. They called it the sweet salt.
The sweet salt?
The sweet salt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So a little fun fact about sugar. Not only was it used to sweeten things, it was actually used in the form of a plastic. And they used it in some forms of art. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Because it's able to hold a shape.
Yeah. Like sugar artists.
Correct.
They do like the bending and looks like glass.
Yeah. I'm not sure that the technology was quite so
advanced.
Not then. But I did see some sculptures of things that they had.
That's really cool.
Yeah, like paintings and stuff. So that was pretty interesting. So with the sugar, believe it or not, there's actually a bittersweet history to it. Sugar cane ended up being introduced into the Caribbean. And so Europeans, of course, they captured humans, leading to slavery. And it was heavily monetized and eventually made its way to the Americas. And that's why we have sugar today here in the Americas, actually. So it's a bittersweet history. There's a lot that goes into it. That's kind of the short and sweet and simple version of that. So,
of course. Speaking of sugarcane, have you ever chewed on a sugarcane?
Absolutely.
Yes, so delicious.
And, as my family is, part of my family is Cuban, we take it and we put it in the juice press.
Yes.
So good.
When I go back to Taiwan, that's how we have our sugarcane juice too.
Delicious.
They just like put it through this machine and it kind of flattens it and then extracts the juice.
So did you know not only is there sugar cane, but there's sugar beets?
Oh.
Yeah. So the sugar cane is actually easily grown in tropical climates. So in the United States, we actually grow sugar beets locally here because it's easier to cultivate.
Oh, wow.
And mass produce.
So under the ground.
Under the ground.
Very cool.
Yeah. It goes through a similar process as does the sugar cane. So it can end up as what we see as our
the little
sugar. Yeah.
Okay. Very nice.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a little bit on that. And it's actually interesting. The molasses, or what gives like brown sugar its color, actually just has to do with the refining process of the sugar. Oh. Yeah. They have to add some lime, some heat. It gets through this, chemical catalyst of this process. And then basically, bam.
You got brown sugar.
Well, sugar. Yeah. Sugar. They have to like spin it down. Oh, yeah. And it separates the molasses. Like the brown is part of that process because it endures that heat.
Gotcha.
It's really interesting.
So brown sugar comes first. That's refined.
Essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know when I was doing some research, there was a lot of talk about refined versus unrefined. So more to come on that.
More to come.
Yes. Talking about the history of sugar alternatives. So today I'll cover a few. I'll cover some natural sugar alternatives. So for example, date syrups, honeys, things like that. I'll also cover some artificial sweeteners. So aspartame, or pronounced aspartame, things like that, ACE. We're going to cover some natural sugar substitutes. So allulose, stevia, monk fruit, and also sugar alcohols. So xylitol, things that end in etol.
All the tolls.
All the tolls. So history, I have my notes, guys. For aspartame, which is a pretty common artificial sugar, it was actually discovered in 1965 by a chemist. Actually, he was working on an anti-ulcer drug when he found that aspartame. So actually, it was an accidental finding when he was flipping the page on his notebook. You know how sometimes people lick their finger to flip? So he was doing that after he was messing with aspartame, and he realized that, oh my gosh, my finger is sweet. So actually, aspartame is artificial, and it's 200 times sweeter than sucrose. So, you know, the sugar we know. It's made out of 2 amino acids, aspartic acid and phenylalanine, and the FDA approved it in 1981. And then for carbonated beverages, 1983.
The 1980s.
Yes,
yeah, 1980s. That's when it became big on the market. I think this is when people were becoming health conscious. Yeah. And there's like a big push.
The big rise in artificial sweeteners. Another sweetener that was approved in the 80s was acetylsulfamine K, also known as ACE-K, also 200 times sweeter than sucrose. And then sucralose, some of you guys might know sucralose. It was actually discovered in London by someone who was looking at pesticides. So they actually discovered sucralose when a research assistant misunderstood instructions. The instructions, I believe, were to test it, but they thought it said taste it. So they tasted the sucralose and found it to be super sweet.
A good thing it wasn't a pesticide.
I'm not sure. But sucralose is derived from sugar, sucrose. There's some replacement and some atoms and stuff, but it's about 600 times sweeter than sucrose.
Wow, yeah.
And sucralose was approved in the 90s to be used.
Interesting.
Yes. Dates and honey, kind of talking about the sugar history. So it dates really, really old. Some origins are from the Middle East. The Greeks used it. Egypt used it as a very prized, not only in cooking, but rituals as well. Skincare also. And honey as well. So honey was used by humans at least 9,000 years ago. There's evidence in the Stone Age. There's evidence in hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt that it was used. In ancient China, back to our episode of tea, Shen Nong also used honey, but in a medicinal way. So it was used in China back then as well. And then in the Roman society, it was used for flavorings and sweetenings of wine. Yes, very good. Other cultures that have used honey include the Mayans and the Babylonians. So yes, that's the history.
And that's specific to honey?
Yes. And then talking about our natural sweeteners, naturally derived sweeteners. For stevia, it's derived from the stevia plant, and it's approximately 200 to 300 times sweeter with 0 calories. So really, really marketable for people who want dessert, and that sweet tooth, but not the calories associated. It was actually used for centuries by people in the South Americas. And it actually gained commercial traction in Japan in the 70s. And after that, it's become popular nationwide. In 2008 is when it really gained traction in the US. And then allulose. Christina, have you heard of allulose?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, allulose is actually a rare sugar, and it's naturally occurring. Sometimes it can be found in figs, raisins, and maple syrup as well. It was first identified in the 1940s, but really, really gained traction closer to the 2015s when it was made available in the granulated version and liquid version. It was first identified as very similar to fructose, so the sugar molecule found in fruits, but it was non-metabolizable by the human body. So that means it passed through the digestive system without being absorbed or used as a carbohydrate or fuel, therefore being 0 calories.
Wow.
And then allulose is still pretty rare. You can't really find it super commonly on the grocery shelves. There's some specialty markets that do have it or online markets that do have it, but they're seeing a growth in the allulose market based on recent research on the benefits of allulose and, those that are really trying to be health conscious.
Yeah. So I think a lot of marketing comes into play for people who are health conscious or diet aware, however you'd like to coin the term. Yeah.
Whatever trend.
Yeah, whatever's trendy at the time.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So I'm glad that you brought up health savvy, right? And being conscious, being health conscious. So a lot of the consumption, right, consumerism, marketing goes into what is appealing to the people, right? And so what is it that we're going to be able to, I guess, sell to us, the consumer, right? And what is going to be appealing to us when it comes to what those health conscious people may be looking for and so on. So a piece of what I'd like to touch on is sucrose in the pleasure center in our brain.
Yeah.
And why diet and the artificial sweeteners, how they interact with that and, versus just the regular table sugar, which is known as sucrose, how that affects our body and the way we interpret it. Yeah.
Tell me more.
So, you look at the sugar, let's just take a spoon, you scoop some sugar, you put it in your mouth. Automatically, there's some sweet receptors that are located in our mouth that send a signal automatically to the mesolimbic system, which is part of our pleasure center, if you will, in our brain. And so ultimately it releases dopamine. And that dopamine secretion is what gives us that desire, that craving to have more of that sugar, because our body loves dopamine, and you eat that sugar and it releases a little dopamine and a little more sugar and a little more dopamine. And so that's part of the way that sugar feeds into our pleasure center.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Whenever we're craving sweets when we're sad or when we're stressed and we want some sweets, that makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense.
Of course. Talking about how sugar kind of works, I did find something interesting about sugar, and unreluctantly, it is a pro, I guess. I found a research study in which they were hypothesizing that sugar may serve as a substitute for ethanol alcohol, especially for those that were in the withdrawal phase, so alcohol withdrawal, for patients or people with alcohol abuse disorder. And they did the study on animals, and it suggested that high concentrations of sugar solutions led to increased ethanol consumption. So that was a correlation. So ethanol and sugar have similar effects, potentially leading sugar to be a gateway effect, I guess. I don't want to say drug. So in rats that were ethanol dependent, so kind of mimicking that alcohol abuse disorder, they exhibited a significantly higher motivation for both ethanol alcohol and sucrose sugar compared to non-dependent. So during acute withdrawal, these ethanol-dependent rats were given both ethanol and the sugar solution to pick, and they actually picked the sugar solution more than they picked the ethanol, kind of hypothesizing that sugar can be used as a tool to help those suffering from alcohol withdrawal.
That's really interesting to know. So it's funny you mentioned that, because with the sugar trade, when the sugar was introduced into, or the sugar cane was introduced into the Caribbean islands, there was actually the way rum came about. What happened was there was someone who had some of the leftover, from the process of deriving the actual sugar from the molasses, if you will. And yeast had fallen into this batch of leftover molasses. And
so fermentation.
And this is ultimately, long story short, is ultimately they were able to derive rum from an accidental yeast blowing into this leftover molasses.
I feel like a lot of things happen when things accidentally happen.
Oops.
Here's a great discovery.
Yeah, they actually, and so the term rum came from rumination, because once they discovered that it fermented, they put it through another distilling process, and then people would drink it. And after that, they called it at the time rumination, and eventually it was shortened to the name rum, and that's where rum comes from. Look at that.
Good to know.
Yeah. And also actually, so apparently in Brazil, there's a lot of sugarcane. I think it's like the largest distributor or largest manufacturer, cultivator of sugarcane. And so a lot of their, at least locally, I'm not sure if it's shipped overseas or not, but their ethanol, their gas, what they use for gas over there is from the sugarcane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So part of their process is deriving it from the sugarcane.
Interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of things kind of connect.
Yeah, absolutely. So
very good.
Okay. So I have a question. Aside from it looks good to drink something with 0 calories with the aspartame, what else is appealing about these alternatives?
These alternatives, that's a really good question. So a lot of your artificial sweeteners are very low in calories. So those who are battling obesity or need to be on a calorie deficit can use these low calorie sweeteners to kind of help and aid their diet. It's also popular among diabetics and those, aiming to reduce that sugar, that carbohydrate intake. So those are some benefits.
Spot on about that. But you know what? I always come back to when it comes to the artificial sweeteners, and I think this might be more true to like the Ace K and the aspartame, since they are so sweet and you're consuming a beverage that is so sweet, your body is recognizing and preparing itself for sugar, essentially, right? Sucrose, fructose, all the oses. Os. But then when it's coming through the body, it's prepared itself to receive it, but there's nothing to break down. It's a trick
for sure. And I know that there are some cons with artificial sweeteners. For example, there's some mixed results on gut health. So for gut health, there are potential risks for weight gain because of kind of what Christina just said, and health gut issues if you're chronically using these artificial sweeteners. They also noticed for higher intake of these artificial sweeteners, there was some sort of link to development of type 2 diabetes as well. So it could very well be because of that craving.
I'd like to chime in on a couple of things there. Yeah. So for the aspartame or the alternative consumption of these sugars or sugar alternatives, it's a good thing you point out about the gut microbiome. And so within our gut, as we know, there's bacteria, good and the bad bacteria. That's what we like to reference it as. And within that bacteria in our gut, they actually have cell-to-cell sensing, and it's actually called bacterial
quorum sensing.
And that's essentially how they communicate with each other in our gut. And so when you have a disbalance, an imbalance of the flora or the bacteria in your gut, it actually can change or determine perhaps your cravings and how much you consume and what kinds of foods that you're consuming. So much so that there was actually some research done, and maybe they're still reviewing this, not sure, but they were speaking of transplantation of feces from one human to the next in an attempt to lose weight because the gut microbiome from another person who was quote unquote healthier would be transplanted into the unhealthier person, therefore morphing that gut biome and inhibiting those cravings and the need or desire to have sweet stuff.
I think I did hear about that on social media a little bit. I didn't do too much of a dive, but theoretically, it does make sense.
Yeah. I know for a while they were looking into this, and I'm not sure if it's popular, but it's certainly out there.
For sure. For my girlies out there, I did find some research. This one is on mice, but this one suggests that there's not such great effects on health, including reproductive toxicity. So aspartame had, throughout their study, significantly decreased the levels of some of your hormones, your FSH, your follicle stimulating hormone, your luteinizing hormone, LH, and progesterone and estrogen too. They found that in the study of mice. And also they found that this chronic use of these artificial sweeteners changed the ovarian and the follicle structures, which they said was like an atrophy. So it kind of degraded and, tissue death of these reproductive organs with the use of this artificial sweetener. It also altered some of like the blood vessels and how it got, down to the reproductive system. So I thought that was very eye-opening.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good point you bring up about the alteration of the blood vessels, because I think I'm about to defend the sugar, the alternative sugars.
This can go either way.
So to the point of sugar, right, causes spikes of insulin, and it also causes, if in excess, of course, too much sugar can cause inflammation. And ultimately, too much sugar can produce more fat in our bodies, more fat stores. And the more fat stores we have that are not necessary for our functioning, unfortunately, will also cause changes in our microvasculature throughout our body, which ultimately will affect our reproductive health.
So inflammation is the killer.
I think inflammation is always the killer.
Are there any positive research that you found with sugar?
Positive studies for sugar. The answer is too much of anything is probably not good for you.
I like that answer.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what I found too.
I'm not sure that I can stand by any statement in particular that says sugar versus artificials.
So speaking of sugar, on my list of sugar alternatives, what would be the most similar would probably be the natural sweeteners. So dates, honey, things like that. And the one benefit to these alternatives is that they do have additional nutrient effects, right? So being that it's not refined or as refined, they have your vitamins, bioactive compounds, and, lots of other good stuff, sometimes fiber if you're using dates or coconuts, right? To kind of complement that sugar.
Which, by the way, feeds your microbiome in your gut.
Yes, it does.
By the way.
Yes, yes.
So I think I have a bigger question. Why do we need sugar or sugar alternatives in our diet in the first place?
Besides it making us happy.
That's it, I think. I don't think there's any other reason.
Can one say that happiness is healthy?
It could be.
Yeah.
I think it depends who you're asking.
And their definition of what healthy means, right?
The saying goes, your health is your wealth.
Yes, indeed. And happiness can be part of that.
Absolutely, 100%. I will say from time to time, I do like to indulge in the sugars and the sweets, of course, because I do have to say I have quite the sweet tooth myself.
Do you?
I do. I try to control that. But what I've noticed is when I'm cognizant of the drinks I'm ordering, for instance, I'll have a cup of coffee. I may not add that extra sugar or any sugar alternatives or honey for that matter.
I see.
Yeah, just because I try to do the little things that might make a big difference.
So speaking of personal preference and ordering, in my culture, Asian culture, actually the term, it's not that sweet, talking about a dessert or something that's supposed to be sweet is actually a compliment. In our palate, in our culture, we tend to not like things overly sweet. So a lot of your American-based desserts, or for example, like the cupcake with American buttercream, for my palate is always overly sweet. So I personally don't really like frosting or anything like that. Like a good whipped cream is good. When I'm baking, when I'm following a lot of recipes, usually I cut them down to like 25% or 50% of what is needed or what is, documented in the recipe. And usually it turns out really good unless I'm following like an Asian recipe. But if you go to a lot of the Asian-based bakeries or like the Korean, French fusion bakeries, you'll notice that it is on the like less sweeter side than if you were to go to like an American bakery.
To that point, I was reading a little bit about added sugars, and you find it like so many things. You'd have to be aware and intentionally look at labels to like really see that there's actually added sugars in there. But part of what we call the quote unquote processed foods actually is partially processed because they're adding all the sugars. Yeah. And it makes it palatable to a lot of people. It kind of goes back into that, marketing and what are we going to get the consumers to get? And so I think a big part of that is a push for we're going to make it so that way people crave this and, we want it, right? Because it's triggering that dopamine secretion.
Of course.
Yeah.
So talking about marketing, I did want to touch on some sugar alcohols. So sugar alcohols are erythritol, xylitol, sorbitol, mannitol, all the tols. Generally positive research that I found. For example, for tooth decay, there is generally no effect on tooth decay cavities and do not significantly affect your blood glucose spikes. So they don't really affect those blood glucose levels. Another thing about sugar alcohols is that research suggests that sugar alcohol is maybe beneficial more for diabetics versus the refined sugar. So your regular is it table white sugar? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, just sucrose.
Sugar, yeah.
Just sugar.
And then some. So another one is called isomalt. I don't know if you've heard of isomalt, but honestly, the way I heard of isomalt was on baking shows that I've seen. So a lot of sugar artists like using isomalt because I guess it's better to work with. But isomalt has been shown to increase bifidobacteria in the gut, suggesting prebiotic effects. So I thought that was really interesting as a sugar alcohol. Some of the more common ones, for example, xylitol, it's been shown to improve glycemic control and reduce blood glucose levels in diabetic people.
Yeah.
Sorbitol has been shown to inhibit the effects of carbohydrates, and kind of help in the digestive enzymes, so also helping with glycemic control. And then erythritol has been well tolerated, no impact on insulin levels or glucose levels seen in the research. I guess the summary is for your sugar alcohols are beneficial if you are looking to stabilize your glucose levels or if you do have an insulin type of health disease. But the con is that chronic use of these sugar alcohols might affect your gut health in the end.
Right. And I think long term, there's a couple different types of diabetics, right?
Yes.
So you have your type 1 diabetes, you're insulin dependent. And then, of course, there's the type 2 diabetics, right?
Of course.
So a lot of times, not always, a lot of times, type 2 diabetes, we always ask the question, lifestyle, right? And discipline when it comes to eating. And so I think the biggest unfortunate part of these sugar alternatives is that it's not really addressing the issue of what's necessary, which would be decreasing consumption. It's also not helping because you have those strong sugar cravings despite it not being a true sugar. And I think that's like one of the biggest challenges when it comes to quote unquote fighting diabetes, right? Because you got to make these lifestyle modifications and really just be strict about what you're consuming. And I've worked with a lot of geriatric patients that are diabetic,
aka old people,
the old folk, and I love them, by the way. And yeah, they're great. And so, they always say little things like, "Oh, well, how are you going to tell a diabetic not to have a sweet tooth?" And of course, I know. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I know it's so hard to say, or so easy for me, I guess, to say, oh yeah, just eat less sugar, right?
Yeah.
And it's because, over time, their body, after having this exposure to this way of life, right? Eating all these high sugar foods, if you will, it's just that's part of their makeup.
Yeah. And that has to do with how we as nurses educate our patients, right? So yes, we can say anything and everything that the textbook, that the research has showed us, but in reality, it's how can we best help these patients in a realistic manner, right? So goals, education, yeah, we can make these, printouts and stuff, but really it has to be attainable and realistic for that specific patient based on their lifestyle, their culture, what their preferences is, in order to set them up for success.
Absolutely. And so setting them up for success leads me back to another story. I had a patient come into the emergency department the other day. Sugar was sky high. It's the holidays, folks.
Of course.
Yes. It's hard. It's hard during this time.
You need your pies and your ice cream.
Everything.
And your cookies.
All of it. And so I was trying to do a moment of education in the emergency department about lifestyle changes. And I was like, it's really important to lay off the juices. You gotta portion control, all this stuff.
And this patient was diabetic?
Diabetic, yeah. And he's like, well, I don't know if I'm really diabetic. I was like, well, when the glucose monitor says high, I think so. But I laugh, but seriously, I was trying to explain to him, you got to be mindful about everything now. You just have to be aware. Even he's like, well, can I just blend all the fruit? I can just take a bunch of fruit and throw it in a blender. And I'm like, I know it seems so simple, but it's not.
Of course, yeah.
And then he's like, well, what about Diet Coke? And I said, well, there's a lot that you need to learn now moving forward. So yes. I was like, just little changes, step by step. But basically, I think, it's really important just to try to understand that this is huge stuff. This is people's day-to-day existence. Yeah. Sugar, Diet Coke. What are we drinking? What are we eating?
And that's a big debate too, right? You have your like Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, whatever, Coke Zero, lovers and then those that have to have a full sugar or
I love Coke Zero.
yeah.
An tall ice glass, very icy. Coke Zero with a straw, please. That's my guilty pleasure.
Fountain or
It's actually I prefer the fountain.
Yeah, that's what
Coke
I've heard.
Zero, yeah.
Okay. I'm not really a soda drinker, but I've heard like the fountain makes a difference. I don't know if it's the carbonation or
something about that. I guess the syrup to whatever
water
sparkling
ratio.
Water. Yeah, they're soda water.
Another common drink that has either sugar or sugar alternatives are your energy drinks as well. There's so many on the market that have either or, so people have different preferences, I guess, based on their taste, lifestyle, and what they're really looking for.
Yeah, I go back to, why are we drinking this stuff in the first place? I love it. I think that's why.
Yes. So for our soda drinkers out there and for our energy drinkers out there, please comment.
Yeah, comment on this.
Comment on this. We're curious.
Yeah, I try to be cognizant. I think I drink a diet soda maybe minimum once a month. And it's probably if I've gone out to eat somewhere and if I'm eating something like a burger and fries.
I'm looking for my notes on soda because I have something on soda. Okay, I have it. Are you guys ready for this? So it's under my notes of cons of sugar.
No.
So your sugar-sweetened beverages. So actually there's a well-established link between obesity and your sugar beverages. So like your sodas and stuff like that. So even though that the sugar sweetened beverages have a direct link in obesity, some research state that your high sugar beverages intake may increase your risk of obesity related cancers. So for example, your breast cancers, your prostate cancers. However, there's some like evidence that's limited, but I thought it was really interesting that they did found that correlation with obesity and are now looking at the possible correlation with cancers.
It's the inflammation.
Inflammation's the killer.
All right, I'm just going to take a real quick look here because I actually wanted to talk about something regarding the sugar alternatives. You know what I used to call it? I try not to call it like this, but it's what I call it.
What?
The cancer enhancer.
Oh, wow.
I know. The cancer enhancer. So, there's different divisions of research. The World Health Organization has some, American Cancer Society, and then there's the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And actually, probably more recent than not, there's been a statement released. And the statement is not conclusive, but it says one of its major roles is to identify causes of cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies as a possibly carcinogenic to humans. So I think there was research on this before. I don't think there was any conclusive statements. This is also saying a possible carcinogenic.
And this is a 2024 statement?
Just very recent in the last 2023.
Okay. Yeah.
And it says, based on limited evidence, it may cause cancer, specifically liver cancer in people. Which is interesting because that's where, some gluconeogenesis happens. Our liver is our filter, so on and so forth.
Alcohol.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so I think the liver has to work a little harder in order to process the artificial sweeteners. So a little tidbit there, which I find also, I guess, interesting because some pesticides are actually ranked in that same category as possible carcinogenics. So not firm, it's a possible. And there's another one that's actually probable, but yeah. That's some of the research,
It's interesting how a lot of pesticide research and sugar research kind of is linked.
Yeah, no direct correlation, but definitely they're topics that I think there's more and more research being done on these things.
For sure.
Yeah.
So the last subject I really wanted to kind of touch on is your allulose, monk fruit, stevia, known as natural low caloric sweeteners. So I did do a little bit of research, but for my personal wants and needs, I did do more research on the allulose because, on social media, it is up and coming. It's kind of getting a little bit more traction in the market, and it is one of the sweeteners I do stock in my pantry. I will say based on personal preference, it is significantly less sweet than sugar. So I do notice I have to use a little bit more, like especially my coffee, for it to actually taste like sweet.
Sweet enough.
Yes. But for allulose, it is a low caloric sugar substitute, and it is found in some foods and beverages. It does have a similar chemical formula, but different molecular structure arrangement than fructose. So that's the one found in fruit. Approximately 70% of your ingested allulose is absorbed, with a lot of it reaching the colon, where it is fermented by the gut microbiome. So, kind of talking about feeding the gut microbiome, the microbiota, most of it does reach down there. So that was really interesting. Another great thing about allulose is that some studies suggest that it will help with glucose control, and it does because of that glucose control, it promotes weight loss.
Oh, that's really nice. So maybe that might be a little more favorable for people who are looking to be more conscious about their, caloric intake or their sugar consumption.
I will say, though, because this is a little bit more new, up and coming, there is limited research on it. I do know a lot of it was found very recently, the studies that I've seen. But one of the concerns about allulose is that they're trying to make sure there's no relationship with that and any pathogenic bacterias. Particularly, there's one that they were looking at, Klebsiella. Cake pneumonia, and making sure that the consumption of this isn't leading to increased risk of infections.
Yeah. So there's a lot of this that ties back to our gut microbiome. Yeah. And then the way that it's actually just being processed and part of the digestive process, right?
Yes.
So, and the way it makes its way through our body. Interesting. I guess we'll see more to come on the allulose.
More to come on allulose, guys. I didn't do much research on stevia because I just personally don't like stevia.
Yeah, I'm not gonna knock it. I think it's okay. It's just that aftertaste for me.
Yeah.
So if I'm gonna have sugar, if I'm gonna have something sweet, I think it should be worth my calories. It should be worth my time, my consumption time.
I will say there are a lot of pros that I found of stevia, including that it's generally safe. Yeah, I didn't really find too many cons. There's some mixed results, but yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic because are we gonna say which is better, which is worse?
That's a good question. So
I don't know if it's conclusive enough.
For our viewers out there, we'd love to hear your comments. Which one you think is the healthiest? Is
sugar
or sugar alternative / sugar substitutes?
Which is it better? Is it worse? Yeah, I don't know. I think in summary, which do I prefer? I think we know which one I prefer. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Healthiest Argument podcast.
Don't forget to join us for our next episode where we'll dive into another exciting and informative debate.
We'd love to hear from you. Head over to Instagram and vote for the topic you think won today's argument.
And while you're there, be sure to follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok for more updates and behind-the-scenes content.
You can also listen to our podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and many more.
Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Healthiest Argument podcast.